Well, good morning. Welcome to our First Baptist Church study for April 19th. We're going to be in Luke chapter 15, Gospel of Luke. Context, though, we're gonna think about 14 a little bit before we get into it. Luke is one of my favorite passages of the Bible. It tells three stories in Luke 15. Jesus tells three stories, but Luke introduces them as a single parable. Now, a parable is a simple story that tells a deeper truth that is meant to illustrate a spiritual, usually, truth. And Jesus speaks in parables regularly. So, for us to understand what's in Luke chapter 15, we need to look at Luke chapter 14. Luke chapter 14, we see Jesus invited to the house of a ruler of the Pharisees. Now, the Pharisees were the religious elite of first century Judaism. The Pharisees and the Sadducees differed in the ways that they viewed certain doctrinal truths. But the Pharisees were the ones who were most committed to holding to the strictures of the law, even to the point of building what was described as a hedge around the law. So they would devise laws beyond the laws to keep them from violating the laws in the middle. And so Jesus is invited to eat at the house of the ruler of the Pharisees in Luke 14. Now in Luke 14 verse 7, we see him telling a parable to those who were invited. Okay, so the Pharisees didn't associate with certain sinners. They wouldn't associate with people that were considered unclean. Oftentimes tax collectors and various occupations were viewed as incompatible. And so these people were on the outside. So he's in the home of a Pharisee, tells a parable to those who were invited. Talks about seeking a place of honor and expecting a place of honor, and the dishonor that's found when someone else is elevated above you. In verse 12 of chapter 14, he tells another parable. This is the one he says, not to the people who were invited, but to the man who invited him. And in this parable, he talks about how the king gives a banquet, invites friends and brothers, etc., so that he might be repaid. And this idea of what about the people that can't repay you? What about the poor? What about the crippled? What about the lame? What about the blind? It says if you invite them, you'll be blessed because they can't repay you, and you'll be repaid at the resurrection of the just. So he's telling the story at the party he was invited to about the people on the outside. And so, as the narrative progresses in chapter 14, we come to verse 25. It's moved beyond outside of the house, and it says, now great crowds accompanied him. He turns to them and he starts teaching the great crowd. So it started with the invited guests, then it turns to the person who had invited him in this party of Pharisees. It moves beyond to the great crowds, and we see people drawing near. And then when we get to verse 15, remember it began in a party full of Pharisees, and now in chapter 15, now the tax collectors and sinners were all drawing near to him. This was all fine and good in the eyes of the Pharisees until this happened. So we're going to read chapter 15. So that kind of gives you this text. Remember, it starts verse 15 or chapter 14 begins at the party of Pharisees dining at the house. Parable to the invitees, parable to the inviter. Moves outside to the crowds accompanying him in verse 25 of chapter 14. So we're going to pick up in chapter 15 with the tax collectors and the sinners. We're going to read the whole chapter. Remember, it's three stories, but Luke describes it as a single parable. And so what we're going to find is the first two are foundational, but they're foundational to build so that he can then lay out what is in the third story. Three very simple stories, each of which is beautiful. And it's given specifically in this context of the religious people were there first, and now the not-so-religious people start to show up. Chapter 15 of Luke, verse 1. Now the tax collectors and sinners were all drawing near to hear him. Okay, why were they doing that? Because he had just said, "He who has ears to hear, let him hear." That's verse 35 of chapter 14. He's telling everybody out in the open, if you hear this, come here. If you want to hear words of life, come here. And so all of a sudden, the tax collectors and sinners say, well, I have ears to hear. I want to hear. So they start to draw near. Chapter 15, verse 1. And the Pharisees and the scribes grumbled, saying, this man receives sinners and eats with them. So he told them this parable. 3 stories, single parable. What man of you, having 100 sheep, if he has lost one of them, does not leave the 99 in the open country and go after the one that is lost until he finds it? And when he has found it, he lays it on his shoulders, rejoicing. And when he comes home, he calls together his friends and his neighbors, saying to them, rejoice with me, for I have found my sheep that was lost. Just so I tell you, there will be more joy in heaven over one sinner who repents than over 99 righteous persons who need no repentance. So he begins this first story with the idea of the lost sheep. If he loses one, what does the good shepherd? Now we know from the book of Ezekiel that there's this promise in Scripture that the Messiah would come and that he would fulfill this role of shepherding, the shepherding responsibilities of Israel's shepherd, both kings and priests, people who had failed in their day to do what it was they were to do. The scribes now criticizing Jesus, they had neglected this role. He says, I will seek the lost and I will bring back the strayed. That's in Ezekiel chapter 34, verse 16. Jesus elsewhere describes himself as the good shepherd. And so he gives this image in the context. Remember, the context is everything. The religious people didn't care for this so much. They didn't like it. There were some people outside of the scope of who they would even teach. They wouldn't teach the tax collectors. They wouldn't teach those almost untouchables in their society. And Jesus says, a good shepherd who loses one goes after it. He goes. He's the initiator. He's the seeker. And he does it persistently. He goes after it until he finds it. And when he's found it, he makes provision for it. He lays it upon his shoulders. He carries it back. He rejoices. There is joy when the good shepherd goes after the lost sheep, finds it because he has been persistent, makes provision for it, and in joy, he brings the sheep home. He comes home. Not only does he celebrate himself, he calls together his friends and neighbors, saying to them, rejoice with me, for I have found my sheep that was lost. Just so I tell you, there will be more joy in heaven over one sinner who repents than over 99 righteous persons who need no repentance. Now, in this crowd of sinners and tax collectors, verse 15 tells us that we're drawing near. This is good news. This is a good story. This is hope. This is something that they hadn't been told before. As a matter of fact, they had been on the outside. People wouldn't even speak to them. People wouldn't eat with them. Jesus draws near. They draw near to him. So he tells this first story of a lost sheep. 1 out of 100. Right? So we've got this 1%. Now, sheep are pretty hopeless when they're lost. Sheep fall in water, they die, right? Their wool will soak up all that water, they will drown. Sheep are virtually defenseless. Sheep are slow. Sheep are a myriad other things. And so when a sheep gets lost, the immediate idea of the shepherd is that the sheep is in danger. Right? The same thing is true with us. When we are apart from God, when we are wandering, the Bible tells us that all we like sheep have gone astray, and the Lord is, and we've turned everyone to our own ways. And that's true. And so when we are out away from God, we are in danger. So we have this 1% of the sheep, this one. And Jesus says, this one's the one I go looking for. Got 99 safe in the fold, I go looking for one. The next story he tells is this story of a silver coin. This what woman having 10 coins. So we went from 100 to 1, a 1% ratio. What woman having 10 coins, if she loses a coin, to 1 to 10, right? So this is 10%. Does not light a lamp and sweep the house. Houses back then would have been dark, either no windows or very limited windows, such that even during the day, you would need to light a lamp. Sweep the house and seek diligently until she finds it. And when she has found it, She calls together her friends and neighbors, saying, "Rejoice with me, for I found the coin that I had lost." Just so, I tell you, there is joy before the angels of God over one sinner who repents. So the common theme is building upon itself here. And the tax collectors and sinners who had once been shut out, who had been drawn near at the command of God, that whoever has ears to hear, let him hear, are hearing this story. And it just keeps getting better and better. There's a common theme. There's someone who has lost something. And if you've ever lost something, you know that if you've noticed it's lost, it's because you value it. It has value to you. And so someone has lost something in each of these stories. There is something that is lost. There is sorrow over the loss. There is suffering until it's found, right? And the suffering is on the part of the one who has lost it. The person, whether it's the shepherd who's lost his sheep, or the woman who has lost the coins, they are endeavoring to find that which is lost. Now that picture doesn't show up as clearly in the third story, but these are described as one parable for a reason. It's so that we might understand that finder and that seeker and that sufferer is not necessarily first and foremost the lost thing, but it is the one who has lost that which is his. And so we see that suffering, and then we see satisfaction when it's found. So we've got a lost sheep, we've got a lost coin, and then he tells the third story. And again, all of these are described together as a single parable. In verse 11, and there was a man who had 2 sons. Right? So it went from 1 out of 100 to 1 out of 10, 1 out of 2, each of which a sheep, a silver coin, and a son, increasing in value. And the younger of them said to his father, "Father, give me the share of property that is coming to me." And his father divided the property between them. Not many days later, the younger son gathered all that he had and took a journey into a far country. And he squandered his property on reckless living. Okay, so a son, one of 2, would have been entitled to an inheritance when his father died, right? And if you're familiar with the Bible, you would know that in these times, the older son, the firstborn son, would get a double portion in terms of the inheritance, not to spend it upon himself, but to be responsible to care for the household of the father. And so this son, the younger, he's not going to get the double portion. He's going to get the single portion. So the 1/3 of his father's inheritance says, "Hey, Dad, give me what I got coming to me." Right? You don't really have anything coming to you. Your father doesn't owe you anything, but in this guy's young mind, he thinks he does. And essentially what he says to him, "I'm not willing to wait for you to die, but I pretty much wish you were dead. I'd like my money, and I'm going to go away." And so he takes, the father obliges. The father says, here's your portion. Here's your inheritance. And not many days later, younger son says, "I'm out of here." So here he was living as a son in the household of the father. He had provision. He had all of his needs met. He had relationship, fellowship, friendship. He had all of the things that come with being at home. And he says, "I'll take the money and I'll go." And so he goes. He took all that he had. He journeyed to a far country, left his father's house, left his father's presence, and there he squandered the property in reckless living. And then when he had spent everything, verse 14 of chapter 15 of Luke, a severe famine arose in that country and he began to be in need. All right. So we've got this son who is rebellious in nature, began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country, who sent him into his fields to feed pigs. Now, feeding pigs isn't a joyous occupation under any circumstances, but we need to take a step back and understand who we're talking about here. We're talking within the Jewish religion, pigs were considered unclean. To be into the presence of pigs was deemed to be defiling. And so he finds himself not only away from his father's house, but he finds himself working in a pigsty. Hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country who sent him into his field to feed pigs. And he was longing to be fed with the pods that the pigs ate, and no one gave him anything. So we have this rebellious son says, Father, give me my inheritance before you die. I want nothing to do with your household. I want to get out of here. He takes it, he squanders it, he loses it all. He finds himself in the pigsty, longing for the sustenance that the pigs were eating, willing to eat pig food because he is starving, he has nothing. And it said, and no one gave him anything. Outside of his father's house, he is miserable. Outside of his father's house, he is hopeless. Verse 17, but when he came to himself, he finds himself, this son of a wealthy man, having squandered his living, comes to himself, and he says, how many of my father's hired servants have more than enough bread? But I perish here with hunger. I will go. I've destroyed the relationship. I have told my father, I'd just as soon you be dead. I'll take what I got coming from you now. I've wasted it all. I've wasted it. I've lost it. I have nothing to come to my father with. But my father's servants in his household don't lack. I will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven before you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me as one of your hired servants. Verse 20 says, and so he arose, and he came to his father. So he's got this in his mind. I'm returning to my father. I will rather be a servant in the house of my father, where I once was a son, than be a servant in the house of a stranger, where I have nothing and no one. So verse 20, he arose and came to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and felt compassion. What does that tell you about the father? How does the father see someone a long way off? He's looking. And we know from the first two portions of this parable, remember Luke tells us this is one parable, that it is the one who has lost the thing of value to him who looks. And so when we look at the rest of Scripture, we see this story filled in completely, where we see that it is God himself who is the author and the finisher of our faith. The Bible tells us there's none who seeks God. There's none who goes after him. God is the pursuer always of us. And so we see this father, he knows his son. He knows there is a place. He's looking. And the Bible tells us that when his son was a long way off, his father saw him because his father was looking. And he felt compassion. Why did he feel compassion? Did he feel compassion because the son was worthy? No, the son has been shown to be unworthy. Did he feel compassion because the son had something to give him? No, the son has shown himself to be completely destitute. He has nothing to give. He felt compassion because of the nature of the father. It is the nature of the father, a good father, to feel compassion upon the son. His father saw him and felt compassion and ran and embraced him and kissed him. A beautiful picture we have here. Now remember, the son had already rehearsed what he was going to say. He said, I will arise, I will go to my father. This is verse 18. I will say, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me as one of your hired servants. So he says, all right, I'm going to appeal to the good nature of my father and say, make me at least one of your servants, because the servants at least have food. The father runs, embraces the son. Son begins to give his spiel. He had rehearsed it. He had thought about it. He had had all of this time to imagine what it would be like to encounter his father and what might he say that would bring him into the good graces of his father. And so he starts his spiel. And the son said to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Bam, end of quote. Why? Because father's not hearing any of it. Father doesn't let him finish. The father doesn't hear the rest of the story. It says the father said to his servants, bring quickly the best robe and put it on him, and put a ring on his hand and shoes on his feet. We see this father's actions indicating a complete forgiveness. There is no question of the forgiveness of the father here. There is a restoration of the relationship. He interrupts his son's apology. He doesn't want to hear it. Doesn't want to hear any of this nonsense about becoming a servant in my house. He says, I want to bring him the best robe. The best robe is a mark of distinction. I want you to bring him a ring and put it on his finger. Throughout the Bible, a ring symbolizes authority. Slaves don't get robes. Slaves don't get rings. Slaves don't get shoes. Slaves in first century Palestine would not have been wearing shoes. He says, I want you to get some shoes and put them on his feet. And so they do. And bring the fatted calf and kill it, and let us eat and celebrate. And so as we're reading through this, we see this father's reaction. And the father's reaction is one that indicates complete reconciliation, complete restoration. He is not part son. He is not servant. He is not son of lower level, son of lower rank. He is fully restored to his father. He says in verse 24, why do this? Why bring the fatted calf and kill it? Why let us eat and celebrate? Verse 24, for this my son was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found, and they began to celebrate. Someone who has lost something, the father. Something lost, the son. Sorrow over the loss, suffering until that which is lost is found, and then satisfaction over the recovery of that which was lost. Story number 1, the lost sheep. Story number 2, the lost coin. Story number 3, the lost son. Now remember though, he wasn't just telling this story to the tax collectors and sinners, right? Verse 15, or chapter 15, verse 1 tells us that the tax collectors and sinners were drawing near to him, who had been around him before. Those who had been around him before were the Pharisees, right? Chapter 14, he was at the Pharisee party where he gave the parable to the host. He gave the parable to the invited guests. Chapter 14, verse 25, the crowds began to accompany him and ask him questions. He said, if anyone has ears to hear, let him hear. And so chapter 15, verse 1, tax collectors and sinners begin to draw near, and he tells this story. Who do you think enjoyed this story the most? Right? Because chapter 15, verse 1 or verse 2 tells us the Pharisees and scribes grumbled when the tax collectors and sinners were drawing near, and they said to themselves, this man receives sinners and eats with them. And Jesus tells these stories, and he doesn't end with the story of the son coming home. He ends with the story of the other son. Chapter 15, verse 25. Now his older son was in the field. And as he came and drew near to the house. Now this was the older son. This is the one who never left. This is the one who had, from all outward appearances, never squandered his inheritance. He had never said to his father, I'd just as soon not be in your company. I'd just as soon you be gone. I'd just as soon leave this place. He had never done that. The older son was in the field. And he came and drew near to the house. There are two audiences to this message. The message of the sinners and the tax collectors who are overjoyed at what they're hearing. And the message of those who viewed them as outside the scope of God's grace, who need to hear a lesson too. The older son was in the field, and as he came and drew near to the house, he heard music and dancing. And now this is God's picture of how God celebrates over a lost son who is brought home, over a lost sheep brought back into the fold, over a lost coin. God's way of celebrating involves calling together those who will share in the celebration and dancing and singing. And verse 26 says, and he called one of the servants, this is the older son, and asked what these things meant. And the older servant said to him, your brother has come home. And your father has killed the fatted calf because he has received him back safe and sound. But the older brother was angry and refused to go in. His father came out and entreated him. But he answered his father. He said, look, These many years I have served you and never disobeyed your command. Yet you never gave me a young goat that I may celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours came, who has devoured your property with prostitutes, nobody's pretending that this younger son was an upstanding young man. He was a repentant young man. That's all he was, and that's all that mattered to God. He's devoured your property with prostitutes. You killed the fattened calf for him. And he said to him, Son, you are always with me. All that is mine is yours. It was fitting to celebrate and be glad, for your brother was dead and is alive. He was lost and is found. We've got this younger brother. This younger brother found himself in a horrible position of his own design, of his own making. No prospect for getting himself out of it. He comes to a point of conviction of his sin. He realizes, I have sinned against my father in the eyes of the world. He's contrite, right? He recognizes this was a wicked thing to do. This was a wrong thing to do. I have become what I did not want to be. I am where I do not want to be. He confesses his wrongdoing, confesses the reality of his situation, does not pretend to withhold from his father the depth of depravity that he had found himself in, the depth of hopelessness. And in confessing, he is converted from a position of lowliness into sonship on the basis of one thing: his father's forgiving mercy, his father's grace, and his father's love. The older brother sees it. The older brother hates it. Says, these many years do I serve you. The father says, Son, my son, you're my son. You have despised the privilege of sonship. The older brother doesn't hear it. He says, I've never transgressed at any time. The father says, you're always with me. Right? You have the fellowship of being with me. Is that not better than anything else? He says, you never gave me a young goat. The father says, Son, all that I have is yours. That's what he says to him. All that I have is yours. Son, you are always with me, and all that I have is yours. The tragedy of the older brother is that he had the privilege of sonship, he has the blessings of fellowship, and he has the riches of what it means to be an heir. Son, all that I have is yours. And ignore them all. So there's a message for us both, for us all here. Those who are outside of Christ, those who are like that sheep that has gone astray, like that coin that is lost, like that son that has left, the prodigal son. The message there is that the Father values and rejoices over the returning. There is no sin, there is no transgression, there is nothing so great as to overwhelm the mercy of the Father for the one who turns and confesses and repents and returns. The Father does not bring in the repentant and give them a position of servanthood. He brings them in as sons and daughters, fully restored, puts on them the robe, puts on them the ring, puts on them the shoes, and rejoices over the son or daughter that returns. The message for the son or daughter who has gone prodigal is return. Your sin will never overwhelm the grace and the mercy of the God who loves you. The message for those who are in the camp: don't get hardened. Don't become the older brother. Don't despise the privilege of sonship that you have. Don't despise the blessing of fellowship. Don't despise the riches of what it means to be an heir of God. There's no room in the family of God for this kind of a heart, for this kind of a mind. What God is doing is worthy of joy, worthy of celebration, worthy of rejoicing, and infinitely so. And so there's a warning, there's a blessing, there's joy, there's hope, there's promise in this one parable in 3 stories. And so I hope you meditate upon that this week, give some thought to it, and take God at His word and be thankful for it. I'll see you guys next Sunday.